The Princess in Trouble. The galaxy was peaceful, but only for a little while. Across the stars, in a distant corner of the universe, there was a planet called Zoreth. Zoreth was known for its beauty and power. It was ruled by Princess Ayara, a brave and wise leader, loved by her people. She was not just a princess, she was a symbol of hope and strength for the entire galaxy. But all that peace was shattered in an instant. One quiet morning, as the stars shone brightly above Zoreth, a dark, menacing fleet of alien ships appeared out of nowhere. They were from the Xarthian Empire, a ruthless race known for their violence and hunger for power. Their ships were massive, black as night, and armed with weapons that could destroy entire planets. The Xarthians had been planning to take control of Zoreth for years. Now, the time had come. Princess Ayara was in her palace when the alarms began to blare. The ground shook, and the sky was filled with explosions. The Xarthian fleet had attacked without warning. The princess rushed to the palace balcony, looking up at the sky in shock as the enemy ships fired their weapons at her planet. Zoreth's military tried to fight back, but the Xarthians were too powerful. The princess's people were no match for the invaders. "Get to safety, my princess," her chief advisor, Kalen, shouted, pulling her away from the window. His face was full of worry. "You must escape now." But Ayara refused to leave. She couldn't run. As the ruler of Zoreth, it was her duty to protect her people. She grabbed her sword and headed for the palace gates, determined to fight back. Before she could make it outside, the doors burst open. The Xarthian soldiers had arrived. They wore heavy armor and carried terrifying weapons. The princess was outnumbered and outmatched, but she was fierce. She took a deep breath and prepared to fight. Her hands tightened around her sword's hilt, and she charged into battle. She fought with all her strength, cutting through enemy soldiers with precise strikes. But there were just too many of them. One by one, they overwhelmed her. A Xarthian soldier struck her from behind, knocking the sword from her hand. She fell to the ground, pain rushing through her body. She looked up, but everything was blurry. The last thing she saw before losing consciousness was the dark, cold face of her captor, a tall Xarthian warrior with glowing red eyes. Meanwhile, far away on Earth, a human student named Daniel was in his dorm room, reading a book about ancient wars. He was a typical 21-year-old, focused on his studies, dreaming of one day becoming someone important. He never imagined his life would change so suddenly. As he flipped through the pages, a loud noise filled the air, coming from the communication system on his desk. It was a broadcast. News channels across the galaxy were reporting the same thing. His eyes widened as the images on the screen changed. There was Zoreth, and in the center, Princess Ayara, captured by the Xarthians. The broadcast showed her surrounded by enemy soldiers, being dragged away. The princess, who had once stood tall as a symbol of peace, was now a prisoner. Daniel couldn't believe his eyes. He had heard of Zoreth before, but he never thought something like this would happen. The princess's image on the screen flashed for a moment before it cut to a dark, intimidating figure, the leader of the Xarthian Empire, known as General Xarnok. His cold voice echoed across the screen. "The princess is now our prisoner," General Xarnok declared. "We will use her as leverage to gain control of Zoreth. This is only the beginning." Daniel's heart raced. He couldn't just sit back and watch. He had always dreamed of doing something more than studying and reading about wars. This was his chance. "I have to help her," Daniel muttered under his breath. His hands clenched into fists. He had no idea how he could, but the thought of sitting idly while the princess was in danger didn't sit well with him. He had to do something. At that moment, a strange thought crossed his mind. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't trained in combat. But he knew things. He had spent countless hours studying alien races, their technologies, and their history. He had a deep understanding of the tactics they used. The thought that he, a simple student, could do something about this felt impossible, but the idea that he might be the only one to do something made him feel both terrified and determined. "I'm going," Daniel decided, standing up. He grabbed his backpack and started throwing supplies into it. His mind raced with ideas, thinking about how he could infiltrate the enemy lines, how he could save the princess. But one thing was clear: he couldn't do it alone. He had to find allies, and he had to move fast. The princess's fate hung in the balance. Time was running out, and Daniel knew he had to act quickly. He had no plan, no experience, but he had something the Xarthians did not expect: the heart and will of a human willing to fight for what was right. His journey had just begun. The student's decision. The news broadcast cut off, leaving Daniel alone in his dorm room. His heart pounded in his chest as the weight of the situation hit him. He stared at the screen, his mind racing. Princess Ayara was in the hands of the Xarthians, and the whole galaxy seemed helpless. Everyone else would wait for the military to act. But Daniel couldn't sit back. He knew he was just a student with no real combat experience. But this felt like his moment. The chance to prove that humans weren't just bystanders in the galaxy. They could fight, and they could win. "Someone has to do something," he muttered to himself. He quickly grabbed his backpack and packed the essentials: his laptop, a few energy bars, a water bottle, and most importantly, his research notes. Daniel had spent years learning about alien technologies, ships, and war strategies. While he wasn't trained in combat, he was a master of tactics, and he'd read every book, watched every document, and studied every battle strategy. If anyone could come up with a plan, it was him. He knew the task ahead of him wasn't easy, but he had no choice. The princess was counting on someone. He might not be a soldier, but he was going to try. The first step was clear: find a way to Zoreth. Daniel's plan took shape over the next few days. Using his university connections and the information he had gathered over the years, he managed to hack into a secure transport system. It wasn't perfect, and it was illegal, but it was the fastest way he could get close to Zoreth. Daniel wasn't a criminal, but in this situation, the end justified the means. The transport ship he found was headed toward the outer rim of the galaxy. It was scheduled to pick up supplies for a mining colony, but Daniel didn't care about that. He was going to hijack it, sneaking aboard as a stowaway. It wasn't ideal, but it was the only option. As the days passed, Daniel tried to prepare himself mentally. The journey would be long, and he wasn't sure what to expect once he arrived. He had no weapon, no backup, and no way of knowing if he'd even make it past Zoreth's atmosphere. But one thing was certain: he wasn't going to turn back. If he failed, it would mean the end for Princess Ayara and her people, and he couldn't live with that. The night before his departure, Daniel couldn't sleep. His mind kept racing, imagining what might happen. He thought about the princess, the way she had stood strong against the Xarthians, the way her image had appeared on every news broadcast, showing her grace even in captivity. He knew she was a warrior in her own right, but she was trapped. He was the only one who could reach her in time. He stood by the window, looking out at the stars. It was a peaceful view, but tonight it felt different. Tonight, the stars didn't seem so distant. They felt closer, like they were waiting for him to take action. Daniel knew he couldn't afford to be afraid. He had no choice but to be brave. "Tomorrow, I save her," he whispered to himself, a newfound resolve filling his chest. The following morning, Daniel boarded the transport ship under the cover of darkness. The ship was a massive freighter, filled with crates of supplies. As the ship's crew began loading, Daniel snuck aboard, carefully hiding in one of the supply compartments. The ship's low-level security scans barely detected him, and the few guards didn't pay much attention to an innocent-looking cargo shipment. As the ship's engines roared to life, Daniel settled in for the long journey ahead. His nerves were on edge, but he focused on the task at hand. He had a map of Zoreth's coordinates, information on the planet's defenses, and the knowledge he had gained from years of study. All he had to do was get close enough. Days passed in silence. Daniel spent most of the time in hiding, reading through his notes again and again, looking for any possible flaw in his plan. He also studied the ship's systems, trying to learn everything he could about its weapons, shields, and navigation. He needed to know what he was up against if the ship got into trouble. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the ship reached the outskirts of Zoreth's system. Daniel's heart raced as he watched the distant star grow closer. He could almost feel the gravity of the situation pressing down on him. This was it. He was almost there. But just as they entered the planet's atmosphere, disaster struck. The freighter's alarms blared suddenly, shaking Daniel to his core. His first thought was that something had gone wrong with his plan. But then he saw it, a massive Xarthian warship, cloaked in the shadows, emerging from behind a nearby moon. The freighter's crew scrambled, trying to fight back, but it was clear they were outmatched. The Xarthians were too strong. They'd been waiting for this moment. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest. The princess was only a few hours away, and now he was trapped with the same enemy. The freighter's engine sputtered as it struggled to stay in the air. Daniel rushed to the cargo hold, trying to find a way to get past the attacking ship. The transport crew was doing their best to fight back, but they were no match for the Xarthian firepower. "Come on, come on," Daniel muttered under his breath, trying to hack into the freighter's control systems. He needed to find a way to make it to Zoreth. If he didn't, this would all be for nothing. The countdown was ticking, and the stakes had never been higher. Would Daniel make it to the princess in time, or would the Xarthians stop him before he could even land on the planet? Suspenseful hook. The Xarthian ship looms closer, its weapons powering up. The transport ship is on the brink of collapse. Daniel's only chance to survive and continue his mission is a risky move, one that might cost him everything. Will he outsmart the enemy, or will this mission end in disaster before it even starts? The journey to the enemy ship. The alarms echoed through the dark, quiet hull of the freighter. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. His breath became shallow as the ship's sudden turbulence threw him against the cold walls of the supply compartment. He quickly grabbed onto a metal crate to steady himself. "What's going on?" he whispered under his breath, his pulse pounding in his ears. He'd known the risks of sneaking onto this ship, but he hadn't expected this. The sudden jolt was enough to shake even the most experienced space traveler. Peering through a small gap in the compartment's wall, Daniel saw the flashing red lights that signaled a breach in the ship's outer hull. The ship had just entered Zoreth's atmosphere, but something wasn't right. He could feel it in his gut. The freighter's engines sputtered for a moment, then roared back to life as the captain barked orders over the intercom. "All crew to battle stations. Incoming Xarthian interceptors. Prepare for evasive maneuvers." Daniel's eyes widened. The Xarthians. Of course. The enemy fleet would be waiting for anything that might try to enter Zoreth's atmosphere. The princess's capture had been a public affair. No doubt they knew that any rescue attempt would come. He was on a mission to rescue Princess Aara, but he hadn't accounted for the possibility that the Xarthian forces might already be in position. He quickly checked the ship's control panel, tucked under a nearby console. His hacking skills had been enough to get him on board undetected, but now they would be put to the test. The freighter was being attacked by Xarthian interceptors, and the ship's shields were struggling to hold up against the onslaught. But there was one thing Daniel could do. He wasn't just an ordinary student. His studies in alien technologies had taught him how to manipulate basic ship systems, how to override and reroute power, and even how to hack into the communication systems of alien ships. With trembling hands, Daniel began typing commands into the console. He knew that if the ship's shield generators failed, they would be sitting ducks for the Xarthian interceptors. The last thing he wanted was to get caught in the middle of a battle with no way out. His fingers flew over the keys. He bypassed security, overrode the ship's mainframe, and rerouted energy to the shields. For a moment, nothing happened. The console beeped, warning him of the unauthorized access. Sweat dripped from his brow, as the ship shook again, sending him to his knees. "Come on, come on," he muttered under his breath. Then, just as a Xarthian blast hit the freighter's rear shields, Daniel's command worked. The shields flared to life, holding strong against the incoming fire. The ship veered violently to the left, avoiding another barrage from the interceptors. Daniel let out a relieved sigh, but there was no time to relax. The real danger was still ahead. As the ship continued its struggle through the atmosphere, Daniel knew he couldn't just sit and wait. He needed to find a way to get to Princess Ayara's location, and fast. The Xarthians weren't going to stop just because a freighter had a temporary shield boost. They would be hunting for him. The ship began its descent toward the capital city of Zoreth, where Ayara was likely being held. From his research, Daniel knew there was a heavily guarded palace in the center of the city. That's where they would have taken her. He gathered his things and made his way toward the cargo bay, moving carefully through the ship's narrow corridors. The crew was preoccupied with the battle, leaving him an opportunity to move unnoticed. His plan was simple: board a small shuttle from the freighter's cargo bay, fly to the city, and infiltrate the palace. He had no weapon, no backup, and very little time, but the element of surprise was on his side. As Daniel entered the cargo bay, his heart pounded in his chest. The small shuttle was already loaded with supplies and ready to go. But as he approached the shuttle's controls, he froze. A low, menacing growl echoed from the shadows of the cargo bay. A large, four-armed Xarthian soldier stepped forward, its reptilian eyes glowing red in the dim light. It was a warrior, tall and terrifying, its armor glinting in the low light. The soldier had clearly been patrolling the freighter, but Daniel hadn't noticed it until now. For a moment, they just stared at each other. The Xarthian's eyes narrowed, and Daniel's pulse quickened. This was the last thing he had expected. He didn't have the strength or skill to fight one of these creatures head-on. But then, as if by instinct, Daniel acted. He dove for a stack of crates behind him, hiding just out of sight. The Xarthian soldier growled again, taking a step closer, sniffing the air. Daniel held his breath. He knew he couldn't stay hidden for long. The Xarthian would find him sooner or later. But in that brief moment, he remembered the most important thing. He couldn't fail now. With no time to waste, Daniel made a split-second decision. He grabbed a nearby metal pipe. As the shuttle made its descent through the planet's thick atmosphere, Daniel felt a sense of urgency settle in his gut. The princess was somewhere down there, held captive by the very forces he was trying to escape. The city was large, sprawling, and heavily guarded. It was likely surrounded by defense shields, laser turrets, and anti-aircraft weapons. Getting in unnoticed was going to be nearly impossible. But that wasn't the plan anymore. There was no time for stealth. He had no backup, no military-grade weaponry, just his wits and his courage. He could see the palace now. It was a massive structure, a gleaming fortress rising above the city's skyline. The Xarthian forces would be keeping her in the deepest, most secure chambers. He needed to get inside, and he needed to do it fast. As the shuttle neared the city's edge, Daniel quickly analyzed the layout. He wasn't a soldier, but he had studied urban warfare strategies, and he had an idea. There was an old, abandoned industrial complex just outside the palace. It wasn't in the official maps, but from what he remembered, it was a blind spot in Zoreth's security system. It was their best chance. He dove the shuttle toward the complex, narrowly avoiding a few enemy plasma blasts that cut through the air around him. With a violent shake, the shuttle skidded to a rough landing in the industrial complex's cracked and overgrown landing pad. The engine sputtered and died, but Daniel didn't wait. He grabbed his backpack, unbuckled his seatbelt, and rushed out of the shuttle before the Xarthians could target him. The industrial complex was quiet, eerily so, and the darkness seemed to swallow Daniel whole as he darted from shadow to shadow. His heart beat in his throat as he approached the main entry point, an old service entrance. It was a small, almost forgotten doorway that led directly under the palace's outer walls. He quickly pulled out his multi-tool and began hacking into the lock, using every trick he knew to bypass the security. His mind raced as he worked, every second feeling like an eternity. He could hear the distant sound of enemy soldiers searching the skies above, their ships flying overhead in tight patrols. With a soft click, the door opened. Daniel breathed a sigh of relief, his hand shaking as he stepped inside. The cool, musty air of the abandoned complex greeted him. He quickly made his way through the dark corridors, trying to move without making a sound. Each step felt heavy, like the walls themselves were closing in. It wasn't long before he reached the underground level, where the most secure chambers of the palace were located. There were no guards here, not yet anyway, but the place was swarming with automated defenses, drones, motion sensors, and even laser turrets. Daniel's mind raced, analyzing the layout in his head. He had to time everything perfectly. The drone's patrol routes were predictable, but he couldn't afford a single mistake. He had to move fast. He crouched low, staying close to the walls, and navigated through the maze of laser grids. At one point, he had to hold his breath as a turret swiveled past him, its sensors whirring as it scanned for movement. The tension in his body was almost unbearable, but his focus never wavered. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Daniel arrived at the final chamber. A massive vault-like door adorned with intricate alien symbols. Behind this door, Princess Ayara was being held. He didn't hesitate. With a determined look, he hacked the control panel, overriding the lock. The door slid open with a soft hiss. Inside, in a dimly lit chamber, sat Princess Ayara, her hands bound, her once regal armor now a dull, tattered thing, but her eyes still burning with defiance. She looked up as the door opened, her gaze sharp despite her condition. When she saw Daniel, her expression softened, but only for a moment. "You came," she whispered, her voice raw but strong. Daniel nodded, his voice steady. "I promised I would." And just like that, the rescue had begun. Into the heart of the palace. Daniel's breath echoed in the silence of the industrial complex as he moved deeper beneath the palace. His heart pounded in his chest, each footstep a reminder of how close he was to something bigger than himself. The entire mission was a gamble, and he had no idea if he would survive what lay ahead. All he knew was that Princess Ayara, the symbol of hope for the galaxy, was held somewhere in this fortress, and he was the only one who could save her. The corridors twisted and turned like a maze, but Daniel's sharp mind kept him on track. He remembered reading about the old maintenance tunnels that connected the palace to the hidden military bunkers below. The palace was a fortress, but it had a weakness: the underground. Here, in these forgotten halls, there were no guards, at least none that expected a human intruder. As he moved deeper, Daniel's eyes flicked between the dark passageways and the faint glow of his handheld scanner, checking for any signs of security cameras. The last thing he needed was to be spotted before he could reach the princess. But as he reached the main passageway that led up into the heart of the palace, a sound broke the quiet. A voice. "Who goes there?" Daniel froze. His body stiffened, heart racing as he peered around the corner. At the far end of the corridor, he saw two Xarthian soldiers, tall and armored, patrolling the area. They weren't close, but they were heading in his direction. Daniel's mind raced. Without thinking, he backed into a narrow alcove, crouching down behind a stack of old crates. His fingers trembled as he gripped the stun baton. He couldn't risk alerting them to his presence. Not now, not when he was so close. The soldiers came closer, their footsteps growing louder. They were talking, but in their harsh, guttural language. Daniel didn't understand it, but the tone was enough. They were angry. The search for the intruder must have escalated. As they neared his hiding spot, Daniel held his breath. His thoughts screamed for him to do something, but he needed to wait for the right moment. The slightest mistake would mean being caught. No chance for a second try. Just when it seemed the soldiers would pass, a soft beep came from his wrist. A tracker he placed on the shuttle had activated, signaling that the Xarthian patrol had detected it. The soldiers turned abruptly, their heads snapping in Daniel's direction. They had heard the noise. It was now or never. With a burst of adrenaline, Daniel sprinted toward them, his body moving faster than it ever had before. He swung the stun baton with all his strength, catching the first soldier in the knee joint. The soldier roared in pain, its body dropping to the floor with a heavy thud. The second soldier whirled around, raising its plasma rifle, but Daniel was already moving. He ducked beneath the soldier's arm, dodging the blast that sent a wave of heat through the air. Using the moment of distraction, Daniel tackled the Xarthian soldier to the ground, knocking the weapon out of its hands. For a few seconds, the world seemed to slow down as Daniel struggled with the soldier, trying to disarm it. The alien's powerful limbs slammed against his body, but he gritted his teeth and fought back with every ounce of strength he had. He reached up, grabbing the soldier's helmet and twisting it off in a move he had only seen in old war documentaries. The soldier's reptilian face was revealed, a twisted snarl on its lips as it tried to recover. But it was too late. With a well-placed strike, Daniel knocked the soldier unconscious, collapsing next to it, gasping for breath. He didn't have much time. Now with two incapacitated soldiers, Daniel stripped them of their weapons and equipment. He had to move quickly. He grabbed a keycard from one of the soldiers' belts, hoping it would grant him access to the palace's inner sanctum. He didn't waste time thinking about the consequences. If he lingered here too long, more soldiers would arrive, and that would be the end of it. He stood up, adjusting his borrowed Xarthian armor, hoping it would help him blend in long enough to get through the next obstacle. His heart raced, but he steadied his breath, focusing on the task at hand. The keycard worked. The heavy door to the palace's main security corridor slid open with a soft hiss. Daniel stepped through quickly, the sound of his breathing loud in his ears. The corridor was lined with steel, every surface designed to look intimidating. At the far end, a set of guarded doors led to the central holding cells. He could feel the princess's presence now. Close, so close. As Daniel approached the holding cells, he could hear the clanging of heavy locks from the other side. He wasn't far from Ayara. His fingers moved to the keycard, swiping it across the door's scanner. The doors slid open with a hiss. Inside, in a small, dimly lit room, Princess Ayara sat shackled to a cold metal chair. Her long hair was disheveled, and she looked weary, but her eyes, those fierce, unyielding eyes, lit up the moment she saw him. You're human," she whispered hoarsely, disbelief in her voice. Daniel didn't respond at first. He was too focused on the task. He stepped forward, his hands shaking as he approached the shackles binding her wrists. Without a word, he began to work on unlocking them, his mind racing. This was the moment he had come for. "You've come for me," Ayara said again, her voice gaining strength as she looked up at him. "But how? You're just a student. A child." Daniel met her gaze, finally speaking. "I'm not a soldier. I'm not a hero. But I'm not going to let them keep you here. You're the future of Zorith. You are hope, and I won't let them destroy that." For the first time since he arrived, a small smile appeared on Ayara's lips. "Then we have little time to waste, don't we?" The heart of the fortress. The air in the palace corridor felt colder, almost sterile, as Daniel moved deeper into the heart of the fortress. The walls were made of sleek, alien metal that shimmered with a soft blue light, casting eerie shadows on the floor. The weight of the situation pressed on him. He had made it this far, but the hardest part was still ahead. The Xarthian armor he had stolen was cumbersome and uncomfortable, but it provided a crucial advantage. The security systems here were designed to detect intruders, but they were set to identify human signatures and scans. With the armor on, Daniel was no longer a human intruder. He was just another Xarthian soldier, albeit one who didn't belong. He moved swiftly, keeping to the shadows, and avoided the main routes. The corridors were empty for now, but he knew that wouldn't last. The palace had hundreds of guards, and the princess would be held in the highest, most secure chambers. There was no room for mistakes. As Daniel turned a corner, he saw the first sign of activity in this part of the palace: a patrolling guard. The soldier was standing at a junction, scanning the area with a weapon in hand. Daniel's pulse quickened, but he forced himself to remain calm. He ducked into a nearby alcove and waited, heart racing as the soldier's steps grew louder. The Xarthian soldier paused right in front of the alcove, scanning the air around him, clearly on alert. For a moment, Daniel thought he was caught, but he held his breath, staying perfectly still. The guard's attention wavered for just a split second, and Daniel seized the opportunity. With lightning speed, Daniel grabbed the soldier from behind, wrapping his arms around the guard's neck and forcing him into a chokehold. The soldier struggled, but Daniel was stronger than he appeared, his training in strategy and survival giving him the edge. With a final grunt, the guard went limp, and Daniel dropped him to the floor, carefully ensuring the body didn't make any noise. He knew he couldn't afford to leave a trail behind, so he quickly dragged the soldier into the alcove and locked the door behind him. The deeper Daniel ventured, the more intense the palace's security became. Laser tripwires were strung across the hallways, motion detectors flicked on and off, and the air itself seemed to hum with the presence of surveillance systems designed to catch the slightest anomaly. But Daniel's quick thinking and the knowledge he'd gained about alien tech gave him a significant advantage. Each time he came across an obstacle, he hacked into it, bypassed it, or found a way around it. Minutes turned into hours as he navigated through the winding corridors. His legs burned from the exertion, but he couldn't afford to rest. Not now. Every passing second was a moment closer to the princess, but also a moment closer to being discovered. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Daniel reached the central chamber of the palace. The door was massive, adorned with intricate alien symbols, and sealed with a biometric lock that could only be opened by a high-ranking officer. He had no way to get through it quietly, and the tension in his chest threatened to crush him. This was it, the final barrier. Daniel glanced at the unconscious soldier he'd hidden earlier. He needed that soldier's clearance. He had no other choice. After a few minutes of carefully stripping the guard of his armor and scanning the biometric data, Daniel was able to forge the necessary credentials. The door hummed to life, its seal breaking open with a low, resonating sound. Behind it lay the heart of the palace, an enormous chamber. The walls were lined with shimmering, translucent panels, displaying hundreds of alien artifacts, statues, and weapons. But in the center of the room, in a heavily guarded, force field-protected cell, was the one thing Daniel was here for: Princess Ayara. Her regal features were bruised, and her once pristine armor was damaged, but her defiance remained. Even imprisoned, she sat tall, her eyes sharp, filled with hatred for her captors. Daniel's heart ached as he saw her, shackled to a high-tech chair in the center of the room. 2 Xarthian guards flanked the cell, and a force field pulsed in the air around it. For a moment, Daniel hesitated. The plan was always to get close, but seeing the princess so broken yet strong made him feel a weight he hadn't expected. This was no longer just a rescue mission. This was about survival. For both of them. He took a deep breath and steeled himself. He had to move fast before the guards realized something was wrong. His mind raced, calculating the most effective way to disable the force field and neutralize the guards. The equipment on his belt, stolen from the unconscious soldiers, could give him a fighting chance, but he had no idea how much time he had left. The first move was clear. He grabbed the plasma disruptor, setting it to low power mode. The guards were too close, and he couldn't risk alerting them too soon. With a flick of his wrist, Daniel launched a distraction. A small but loud explosion at the far end of the chamber. It sent a flash of light and noise into the air, and both guards turned toward it, weapons drawn. Daniel seized the moment, sprinting toward the force field's control panel. He didn't know if the plasma disruptor would disable it, but it was his only shot. He took a gamble and aimed, firing the weapon at the field generator. The force field flickered once, then went dark. The room fell eerily silent. Princess Ayara's eyes widened as she saw Daniel standing at the control panel, the force field down. The guards were already reacting, but they were too slow. Daniel had a fraction of a second to move. He raced toward the princess, his heart pounding, and with one swift motion, broke her shackles. She rose to her feet, her eyes flashing with fire. "We're getting out of here," Daniel said, his voice urgent. Her gaze softened for a moment, before hardening once again. "Not without them paying for what they've done." The soldiers were closing in, but for the first time in this mission, Daniel wasn't afraid. He wasn't alone anymore. The two of them, against the universe, together, they were unstoppable. The final confrontation. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest as he studied the force field surrounding Princess Ayara's cell. The guards on either side were a major obstacle, but they weren't the true threat. The real danger was the force field itself. It would take a sophisticated hack to get through it, but he wasn't a stranger to challenges like this. He had no time to waste. If he didn't act quickly, the entire palace would be on high alert. He glanced around the chamber, taking in the environment, the shimmering panels on the walls, the Xarthian weaponry on display, the strange alien artifacts, all beautiful, all distracting. But none of them helped him in this moment. His focus was entirely on the princess. She was the reason he had risked everything. The two guards by the cell hadn't noticed him yet. Their focus was entirely on the flickering holographic maps in front of them. Their weapons hummed loosely by their sides as they discussed something in their native tongue, oblivious to the human intruder standing just a few meters away. Daniel moved silently, his footsteps absorbed by the thick carpeting. With a deep breath, he ducked into the shadows, pulling out a small device from his belt. It was a modified disruptor, a gadget he had learned to craft during his time on the run. It wasn't powerful enough to knock out a whole facility, but it could temporarily disable certain tech, like force fields or security cameras. He aimed the disruptor at the force field and activated it. A sharp, high-pitched hum filled the room as the device sent out a pulse of energy, scrambling the field's integrity. For a split second, the shimmering barrier flickered, weakening just enough for Daniel to slip through. He didn't wait for the field to stabilize. He darted forward, barely noticing the guards as they turned toward him, their eyes wide in surprise. But they weren't fast enough. With a quick lunge, Daniel knocked the first guard to the ground, disarming him in one fluid motion. The second guard reached for his weapon, but Daniel was quicker. He grabbed the guard's arm, twisting it behind his back, using the soldier's own strength against him. The guard howled in pain, but Daniel silenced him with a sharp elbow to the neck. The two guards fell to the floor, unconscious. Daniel quickly stripped them of their weapons and threw them to the side. He didn't have time for more delays. He finally reached the force field's control panel, hidden in a small alcove to the side of the cell. Sweat dripped down his forehead as he hacked into the system, bypassing several layers of security. His fingers moved like lightning, navigating the alien code with a speed that amazed even him. "Come on. Come on," he muttered under his breath. After what felt like an eternity, the control panel beeped in approval. The force field flickered one last time before completely deactivating. With a soft hum, the barrier disappeared, and Daniel could see Princess Ayara in the flesh for the first time, free of her prison. She looked at him, her dark eyes filled with surprise. Despite the bruises on her face and the chains that still bound her wrists, there was a fire in her gaze. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice low but commanding. Daniel stood tall, holding out his hand. "I'm here to get you out of here. My name is Daniel." Ayara's eyes flickered with recognition, though she didn't say anything. She took his hand, her grip strong despite her exhaustion. But as soon as her hand touched his, the sound of alarms echoed throughout the palace. A voice crackled over the loudspeakers. "Intruder alert. Lockdown in progress. All units, deploy immediately." "Shit," Daniel muttered under his breath. There was no time left. The entire room suddenly lit up with red emergency lights, and a series of heavy doors slammed shut, blocking all exits. The palace was locking down, and security forces would be on them in seconds. Daniel grabbed Ayara's arm and began pulling her toward the nearest exit. They had to get out, and fast. "We don't have much time," he yelled. She nodded, her eyes narrowing. "Through here. Follow me." Without hesitation, Ayara led him to a hidden passageway behind a false wall. She had clearly been planning her escape for a long time. The passage was tight, and Daniel could feel the heat of their pursuers just behind them, their heavy footsteps reverberating through the stone. "We're almost there," Ayara shouted as they reached the end of the passage. The walls seemed to close in around them, but Daniel's eyes caught a glimmer of light from the outside. They were so close to freedom. But just as they were about to break through to the surface, the ground shook with a violent tremor. Daniel stumbled forward, grabbing Ayara's arm to steady her. The palace had started to self-destruct. The countdown had begun. "Move. Now," Daniel shouted, urging her forward. They burst through the hidden door into the night, just as explosions began to rock the palace behind them. The distant hum of enemy ships closing in signaled their final moments of escape. The ground trembled beneath their feet as they sprinted toward the waiting shuttle. The palace behind them erupted in a series of fiery explosions, lighting up the sky in a brilliant, horrifying display. The chaos was their signal to leave. Daniel didn't look back. He didn't need to. The princess was safe. They were free. As they boarded the shuttle, Daniel activated the engines. The roar of the ship's thrusters drowned out the sound of the palace's destruction, and they soared into the sky, leaving the war-torn world of Zoreth behind. For the first time since the mission had begun, Daniel allowed himself to relax, just for a moment. His hands were shaking, and his body ached from the fight. But he had done it. He had saved her, and as the stars stretched out before them, he knew one thing for sure: this was just the beginning.